I am Thomas Schneider, and today I'm going to be covering the right to vote as laid out in the Constitution. There are four amendments that I will be discussing in the Constitution that sort of give the groundwork and explain who in the United States has the right to vote. First of all, we have the 15th Amendment, which says right here that any citizen of the United States cannot be prohibited to vote based on uh, their race. Obviously, this was right after the Civil War. I'm sure we're all familiar with this amendment. It gave African Americans the right to vote. However, you'll notice it specifically is not mentioning anything about women. Um, Now, this is interpreted as Black men have the right to vote, women do not. And that, as I'm sure you know, will come into play later. But as of 1870, Black men were officially given the right to vote in America, whereas before this they could not. Now, obviously, this did not just get accepted by everyone right away, no questions asked. There was a lot of fighting over it. And one such case that went to the Supreme Court dealing with that was United States v. Reese in 1876. So this was the first case about voting rights after the passing of that 15th Amendment. It was not the only one. So for United States v. Reese, there were election officials in Tennessee, and they denied Reese, a black man, of his right to vote. Now, Reese sued for a violation of the Enforcement Act of 1870, which was passed in accordance with or alongside the 15th Amendment. So basically, the Enforcement Act outlined sort of the penalties that would come if you did not follow the 15th Amendment of allowing black people to vote. So that it just sort of outlined, hey, if you don't accept this ruling, then this is what's going to happen. So Reese sued for violation of that, but the court at the time ruled that there were some aspects of the Enforcement Act that were unconstitutional as it pertained to this case. So they sided with the election officials, not with Reese. So he was not allowed to vote. This obviously led to many negative consequences. But again, as in the Constitution had stated, black people had the right to vote at the time. But so what the states did that didn't want them to vote, they introduced some workarounds, including poll taxes and literacy tests. Basically, these were things that when you went to vote, you had to either pay a tax or pass a literacy test proving that you were literate enough to vote. Obviously, if you're a well-off white man, you can afford to pay the tax. You're probably educated and you can pass the literacy test. But if you are an African American man, you're probably not so well off. This, again, is like right after the Civil War. So there's not a lot of opportunity for you to earn money. And you probably aren't educated either for the same reason. So you can't afford to pay the tax. You can't pass the test. Therefore, you can't vote via this sort of workaround system. And the 19th Amendment, which again I'm sure we're all familiar with, granted women the right to vote in America. This obviously came after the suffrage movement and really decades of protesting and fighting for this to come into effect. We're all familiar with this, I'm sure. It was passed in 1920 or ratified in 1920 after the whole suffrage movement. So then women had the right to vote, whereas they did not with the 15th Amendment, as they weren't included in that really up to interpretation. And then we have the 24th Amendment, which sort of, not sort of, which it did get rid of that poll tax and made it unconstitutional to enforce a poll tax at a voting establishment as of 1964, which was a big step in the right direction. It sort of helped to stop those workaround things, the 15th Amendment. So it's a big step in the right direction. However, you'll notice it says specifically president, vice president, senator, representative. These are federal elections. or not state elections, or specifically no poll tax on federal elections. That's where this Supreme Court case comes in. Harper v. Virginia Board of Elections in 1966. So the Virginia, they saw that and they said they noticed that it didn't say anything about state elections. It was just federal elections. So they continued to charge a poll tax for state elections after the passing of the amendment. And Annie Harper, she couldn't afford to pay this poll tax, so she challenged using the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which that basically states that there shouldn't be a law that will stand in the way of any privileges of citizenship of the United States. And she felt that this poll tax law did that. And the Supreme Court agreed with her and found Virginia's poll tax to be unconstitutional. And that ended pretty much all of the poll taxes. And then finally, there was the 26th Amendment in 1971, which gave United States citizens above 18 the right to vote. Prior to this, there actually was no federal voting age. It was just up to the states, but generally it was 21. However, they fought for this amendment with the common slogan, old enough to fight, old enough to vote, because this is around the time where a lot of 18-year-olds getting drafted, but they didn't have a say in the elections, and they felt that they should. So this amendment granted them that. And I'd like to leave off with a Supreme Court case that still sort of has a lasting effect today and isn't quite concluded yet with the right to vote. That's Richardson v. Ramirez. So there were 3 individuals and they had their right to vote stripped because of previous felony convictions. They challenged California using that Equal Protection Act of the 14th Amendment. But the court decided that California's felony disenfranchisement laws were not unconstitutional, citing Section 2 of that same amendment, which basically said that it prohibited stripping of the right to vote of an individual unless they were convicted of a crime or played a part in a rebellion. So they said that if you had been committed a felony or convicted of a felony, you could have your right to vote stripped constitutionally. And as of 2020, there are still around 5.2 million Americans that are not allowed to vote because of a current or previous felony conviction. I'm not aware of any to change that, but I would expect some to come in the near future as sort of the next step in this timeline of being granted the right to vote.